And David?
Hey everyone, I'm another VCU student and interning with the Office of Sustainability this semester.
And Alicia?
Hi everyone, I'm Alicia Sadkoff. I'm the Sustainability Manager, and apologies, but I'm going to turn my camera back off for a little bit. I'm trying to finish eating lunch.
Thank you. All right, Marshall, back to you.
All right, let's get started here. So I will share my screen. Recording is on. So, okay. Can everyone see the slide that talks about how we do introductions? Though we did that already.
Yes.
Okay. Just trying to switch my. If you have two monitors, and you can actually see everybody at the same time. Okay, so I'll move forward. So we're going to, as I said, talk about a series of asset types here. We'll start with roads. We've grouped these together so because things are interrelated, but we'll talk about roads, alleys, bridges, and parking lots. We'll try to do that for about 15 minutes or so. Then we'll talk about transit and rail. So that will be GRTC, stations and routes, Amtrak stations and routes, and then railroads and railroad bridges. And then we'll move on to bike and pedestrian, bike trails and lanes, bike share stations, pedestrian infrastructure, and then multi-use trails and how all of those things are impacted by climate change. And then finally, we'll close off by talking first about marine, which is just the Port of Richmond, and then the Richmond International Airport, which is technically outside the city, but obviously of great concern to the city and so important to be talking about as well. So again, to keep in mind, this is not scientific or perfect. This is a discussion and listening exercise. I will try to talk less and listen more, but you all to talk more. Also listen. We want your judgments based on your knowledge and lived experience. If you're working for an organization that really works on this, please chime up. If it's something you just have personal experience or opinions about, please also share that. Expertise comes from many sources and many forms. We're probably not going to get into the weeds on any one particular asset. What I mean by that is we can talk about bridges. We're probably not going to talk at great length about one particular bridge. That's the distinction here. I mean, if there is a particular asset, it's a particular concern, raise it. We want to record it. We want to make sure that that's something we're paying attention to. But we'll also be able to meet one-on-one later to get further input. This is somewhat of a hypothetical exercise. We do have some maps that I'll be able to share that show, for example, a 2070 flood scenario that the city might be looking at, or the places where urban heat island is most intense. But we're not looking here at specific probabilities. We're looking at if this asset is impacted in this way, what happens, what do we do? So we'll start with roads and sensitivity. Does everyone have in the chat? Do you all have the this survey up? I'm going to put it in the chat again, just to make sure that everyone has it here. There, please click the survey and join that. You'll see when you click next, the first thing will be looking again at road transportation assets, roads, alleys, bridges, parking lots. So sort of open conversation here. We're talking first about sensitivity. So the questions here really are, how are climate impacts currently stressing the asset? So what has happened historically or recently that makes it clear that there's a concern here, or even how might it stress it in the future? Especially if no further action is taken. We are trying, the survey will ask you to score this on a high, moderate, low, in terms of the level of impact, and the discussion, and there's a comments where you can put comments, but the discussion here is to sort of try to tease out the narrative elements there. And we have this map, but if I pull up the roads on it, well, that's everything. That's not that helpful. But I will show you the flood scenario. So this is the river right now. Just to give people said, this is where we're sort of a 2030, 2050 flood scenario due to increased storm and increased sea level rise, and then 2070 flood scenario, as you can see, is spreading out much more over the city. So you see a lot of things that are not currently of concern for floods are impacted potentially by this. So anyone want to start us up talking about concerns, sensitivity around Richmond's roads, bridges, and other infrastructure of that sort?
I am
This is-
happy to. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Diane.
Okay. And I apologize. I'm gonna have to sign off at 2 o'clock, so I'm gonna get my words in now and then. I'm gonna talk up some more on the water side. There definitely are more localized flooding. I think it's because of the higher intensity of storms. The storm system hasn't had the capacity to drain it quickly off the roads. And so you find more places where there's higher water in gutters and stuff, which is a problem for pedestrians, a problem for vehicle safety, and definitely a problem for bicycles because they're usually riding in that gutter or that side of the road. And it would apply to ditches too, roadside ditches. A lot of South Side has roadside ditches that are don't have the capacity to handle these intense storms.
This is Carrie. Diane was tracking with exactly where my head was going. I have a note, drains question mark and flash flood, because with climate change, you're able to precipitate out a lot more water in a shorter period of time. And we experienced this last year, especially where a thunderstorm would sit right over basically the same location and just rain out over an hour to 3 hours. And you'd end up with 4 inches or more of rain in a very small place, which means that that water in a small area is trying to use a smaller drainage or ditch or natural creek network to distribute that water as quickly as it can, but it's not fast enough. So that was my concern.
A good concern. Question I guess I'd put to both of you is, do you feel like we're not getting detailed into strategies here, but is the issue here more the design of the road or the stormwater infrastructure for draining off the storms? I mean, both, I guess you can answer, but
Yeah, it's really the infrastructure that drains it. Well, I mean, many of the roads, particularly a South Side, were probably not even designed as much. I mean, they've been there for, I don't know, 80, 100 years. They were passed, and there's not the crowns that we would design in today where water, sheet flows off from the center. And over time, they've probably settled and failed and not been fixed well. But I think that from that what we were just talking about, I think it's the capacity of the drainage system to handle the intensity of the storm. That's the bigger problem.
Yeah, and I think an example that many of us probably remember from last year was in Churchill at 25th at the roundabout near the Roosevelt, which they just took this picture from inside the restaurant looking out, and it's now a pond as opposed to a road. And it was just because the drainage in that area was overloaded. And we know Churchill's drainage, it's a lot of residences on the hill trying to use an almost historic drainage system.
Yeah, which is combined. So
what I thought I'd just add to that, I think making it even worse is that areas are flooding that haven't flooded in the past, and that's even more dangerous for people who use the roads because we drive around not expecting a big pool of water, and then you come around a curve and suddenly you're in it. So I also wanted to bring up another point, that not just localized storms and storm cells, but also I think what's happening because of Richmond's location is that the crests are hitting longer from precipitation that's happening upstate in the watershed. I don't know if upstate's the right word, but.
you mean in the James?
Yes, yeah.
It would be west
in the
of
James
here.
watershed.
Yeah.
West, so in the James watershed area, that's what I've noticed. is that the crests seem to be much bigger than they used to be and longer. And like trying to predict when that's happening can be a challenge for citizens if they're not even thinking about it, right?
Yep.
Because there's no weather event associated with it directly to them. It may be, you know, in Albemarle County or some county west.
This is Carrie. I'm not a hydrologist, disclosure. I'm a meteorologist.
Oh, wow, that's exciting. I didn't know that.
But that's a great point, Julie, about the crests and the prolonged crests. I'm wondering if the volume that we're getting into the James is not just the fact that, yes, we are precipitating out greater volume into the ground, but is it the ground cover upstream is not, is, for example, paved over, so it isn't porous. You can't receive that soil, that rainwater into the soil, and instead it's running off through the ditches and drains and et cetera into the James upstream. Again, I'm not a hydrologist. I'm just asking the question.
Yeah. I mean, the state laws now really govern that you can't just pave something and not handle the sort of that increased runoff. So in theory, it ought not to have be exacerbated by it, but I'm sure there's still an increase of runoff due to circumstance.
The other thing you see, obviously, with increased storms is the ground is getting saturated. So, you know, if you have a lot of storms in a short time frame, we're going to have flooding just because the ground that used to absorb water isn't anymore.
Yep.
Yeah. Hello, Anthony. I like what we're talking about doing like the whole watershed and upstream. It also comes from like poor education of farmers and how they add this change in like runoff scenarios that they're adding extra stuff into the water that's bringing downstream. And yes, I'm not nowhere near a meteorologist or hydrologist or anything, but coming from areas that I was in church in where this new system of roadways that's being implemented for better transportation means and faster is being flooded because of the poor drainage system that we see, especially in like old sewage lines. I mean, like I did some plumbing stuff myself with my father. He's a carpenter, and like old rust copper pipelines are terrible for your house, so people put in new ones. Just like our drainage system is being poor and seeing these roadways. I mean, we can talk about the poor ability of like how bad we manage our roadways is laughable. Because I know, I mean, I changed my car tires. I mean, that's another like asset or transportation means of like to the person, to the people, to the physical asset of like people and how they get impacted by the community for all these transportation means. And how are we looking at it just to fix only certain roadways that needs to be fixed for a temporary fix than a long-term fix? We're not looking at that deeply in this this form of like climate transportation means of Richmond. So I mean,
we might get into more of that as we get through these assets. We do have a number of them to get to, and I know Diane has to leave, but she has a lot of institutional knowledge. So I would love for you to, when you do have a minute, to go through the survey,
Okay.
and in the comments section, please add any extra information that you'd like to share with us.
I'd be happy to do that. I'm sorry
Thank
that I
you.
can't stay. This would be fun.
Too bad. Dan, anything else you wanted to add to share with the group before you have to go?
The only thing on roads that I would say is they're certainly part of the heat island in the city, a major part of the heat island. And so just considering, the width of roads, how we design roads in the future could help to reduce that impact.
Do we see it cutting the other way too, where roads are the condition of roads impacted by higher temperatures?
Yeah, that I don't know. That's more of a scientist than I don't know. I assume that asphalt deteriorates faster if it's hotter, but I don't know that for fact. But what I was thinking when Anthony was talking too is that the city is strapped, has been strapped. I was the public works director, so I know that for money to maintain roads, there's just not enough money to go around. And so, you know, we stretched the life cycle of our roads to a point that oftentimes they require rebuilding versus just resurfacing. And so you know, and rebuilding probably is a far more higher energy. I don't know where it falls in the heat or water, but it definitely has a higher energy use to do that instead of just a, you know, a more simple resurfacing. So.
What about bridges? Has anyone seen impacts to sort of bridges that are vulnerable being washed out with flash floods and higher storms? That's something that the city's been looking at, and do we know?
And so I'll tell one more thing, and then I really have to go. The Mayo Bridge is the biggest problem for flooding because it's so its elevation of the surface is so low, and it's so old, and it's been studied. So that's sort of the big one. I'm sure there are a lot of other bridges. The city has a lot of bridges. Most of them are crossing roads versus like systems. But time deteriorates them. Hot water threats probably as more water is going through under those bridges that cross waters. You know, the power of water is extreme, and so, you know, deterioration of the substructure is going to happen faster.
It's valuable insights.
Okay, I gotta go. Bye.
Bye-bye.
I'll fill out the form.
Cool. Thank you.
This is
on the video here. You can see all of the bridges that we have mapped, which are probably not a list of all the bridges, but it's a substantial. There's a substantial number.
Alex, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to speak really quick to kind of planning for bike routes, as I know the city is trying to put in more bike lanes and give as many people access around the city via bike. I've noticed that, you know, north side, the east end areas that, you know, have areas of low income, and they are separated from downtown by some pretty big geographical features and also infrastructure like railways or interstates. Bikers often have to go down into these ravines and then uphill to get back into the city. So as we plan for additional bike routes, if the bike routes are going through places that are in these ravines or across train tracks where ponding might happen, to kind of ensure that the infrastructure improvements have been made in these locations to prevent any ponding.
That's super valuable. We're going to talk specifically about bike infrastructure in more detail in just a little bit, but I want to so put that in the parking lot, so to speak. The bike rack, that's better. Moving on to sort of thinking about the capacity of these systems of the roads and bridges and alleys to adapt. Are there particular thoughts people are having around that? Again, when we think about adaptive capacity, the real question here is, as the asset is impacted by extreme heat and flooding, can it adjust with no modification, or does it require substantial modification or cost? That's the question here. Sounds like modification probably is definitely required, since we're already seeing all of these impacts.
One of the things that I think it would be really awesome for us to consider going forward is looking at some of the cities in the Pacific Northwest, like Portland and Seattle. They put a lot of investment into building out bioswales, which is just like a fancy way to say ditches with plants in them that both slow the water down, but also help to absorb more of the water. The only real bioswales that I know of in the city of Richmond right now are outside the Capitol building on 2nd Street, no, 7th, I think that is, or 8th. But anyway, it's like right outside of the Capitol grounds. We have that kind of like going down the hill setup. But I mean, I would love to see things that we're doing road diets. So we're kind of thinning some of these 2-3 lane roads, and that reduces the burden on us to repave significant lane mileage, but also we can build in where the asphalt drains directly into some of those beds that are beside them. I live in Northside, for example, and I have a very aggressive cat. But I live on Northside, and the city just redid Brooklyn Park Boulevard to be safer, and they added in buffers and bump outs. But those bump outs have like 8-inch tall concrete curbs all the way around them, where in reality, we could have actually kept some holes open on the side so that water would strategically drain into those, which would be great to not only reduce the burden on maintenance staff to have to come by and water some of the young trees they've planted, but it would also be a great way to suck more water out of that street, which has a lot of asphalt, both in terms of paved roads, sidewalks, very few tree wells. A lot of the tree wells along that corridor have been paved over, which is why it's historically one of the hottest places in the whole city, and definitely the hottest in all of Northside. But even a lot of the private lots are just parking lots and cement. So basically, I'm all for bioswales and road diets.
I would just chime in to say that that's definitely being used even closer. I live up in Washington, D.C., and we're building a lot of those, and very, very successful at sort of maintaining water during an intense event.
Yeah, let's steal those ideas.
And I just want to check in and make sure that all of you have the survey up. Just give me a thumbs up if you have it up and you're able to do that while we're talking, because we definitely want to capture that kind of survey rating system in addition to all these great comments. So I'm trying to take notes. I know Marshall is, and you have the comments field in there as well.
Julie, did you have something to say? It said you raised your hand. You don't need to raise your hand. You can just talk, but
I think she was agreeing that she had the survey up.
Oh,
okay. Yeah, they need a raise your hand and a thumbs up. They need both in these online tools.
Like an emoji thumbs up thing.
Hello, Anthony.
Anthony, were you going to say something?
I was going to popcorn off Wyatt and what he said about these streetways. I did a project with GIS software of how to reduce like certain streetways and parkways of like flooding areas using permeable street pavement, and using these tools of like modern streetways to like take up some of the flooding scenarios that we have seen, then repaving it with black pavement and continuing to add this annoyance of like before like streetways had these other ways like they can take up water or different ways they can rebuild it. Is I don't know. We did like a bunch of parking lots that we see that continue to be paved and create these urban heat effects, but adding this permeable layer of water and source to take in water and have better groundwater, more stability than cracking up on like just dirt and just letting flooding scenarios happen. I don't know. That's something I thought Wyatt that brought up straight to my head of ways to like implement.
Valuable point here. Thank you, Anthony. As we're thinking about the consequences we're seeing here, we've talked about this a little bit, but before we move on to transit, in the interest of time, I wanted to ask, we have a whole list, you'll see in the survey, a whole list of different sorts of consequences that we're thinking about here. There's the area of service loss, the geographic area impacted, if as an asset fails, the duration of service loss, how long it takes to repair it and bring it back online, cost of damage, public safety, impact on economic activities, public health, the vulnerable populations that are particularly impacted by the failure of an asset, and thinking about that, and then also the impacts on natural resources. But conversely, as we've already talked about, how natural resources may be able to be used to mitigate some of these concerns. So, and the survey asks, rank things from high to low, that are to sort of invite thoughts people have on the consequences, some of the consequences we're seeing from flooding and heat with the road and construction.
So this is Julie. When I think about roads and their vulnerability to water, I rank all roads very high, a very high consequence, based on, I think, what we're seeing in the future with climate change. They're very costly to fix, and if they're damaged or there's no access, it certainly impacts all of these: public safety, economic activities, public health, vulnerable populations, and then the natural environment. I don't think the consequences are high for heat. I think they cause the heat impact.
Mhm.
And I'm trying not to jump to the solution. But I'm wondering, like, when we think about roads and maybe how the city gets money for roads, are these types of things considered, when we decide either to pave or do some of those natural burns that other people have been talking about in the conversation?
And I think that's Julie, I think that last part's a really great question, because I think one of the key elements to the adaptive capacity of a resource is not just its physical construction, but the process that is used for the decisions that are made around it. So if you have a process that is not thinking about these issues and requiring mitigation adjustment of them, that itself limits the ability of an asset to adapt. So. Other consequence thoughts people have? One thing we haven't really talked about is alleys, and this came up in the waste conversation this morning with people talking about flooded alleys as a particular concern for waste pickup. But I should think that's an issue here with the transportation infrastructure as well. That the alleys may not have the same level of drainage as even the roads. Is that something people are seeing?
Yeah, I live in a part of Northside that's not particularly flood prone. One of the biggest issues we have, I think, is the lack of maintenance with a lot of street gutters. We don't have, like the street sweeping or leaf removal that exists in other parts of the city. Highland Park, I think, only gets 2 times a year where they do street cleanings, whereas in wealthier parts of the city, it can be as much as like 1 time a week. So when we have heavy rain events, the things that are still on the street tend to get blocked up. So I've reported the corner of our block to RVA 311 multiple times and sent in pictures of the flooding. I don't know what's different about that drain than any others, but I know it backs up and actually kind of floods across all of North Ave, which is difficult for a bunch of vehicles. In terms of alleys, I think the city is doing a better job. When newer homes are built, they're adding in alley drainage. So in terms of our alley seems to be doing better than the actual street. But I think a lot more could be done. I mean, living in a place that was redlined, we have a lot of missing street trees, and they absorb thousands of gallons of water a year. So if we could have more of a push to plant new trees in historically redlined places and then care for those so they don't die off, I think that would be a way to kind of boost our resilience that's relatively low effort and lower cost than some kind of big interventions.
And that also will helps with reducing urban heat island, which is a way that we can help areas adapt. This is all really great. In the interest of time, I'm going to suggest we move on next section. If you have other thoughts on roads and bridges and alleys, please put them in the comments. But into time, this is the problem. Facilitator, you have to push people on. Everyone wants to talk. So we're going to talk about transit and rail assets next. So this really breaks down into 2 areas. One is the GRTC stations and routes, and then the other would be at the Amtrak stations and routes and railroads and rail bridges. And I'll just pull up on the map here. There's all the bus stops. that you can see. And we'll pull up the rail lines. Rail lines. There we go. Can't really see that though. It doesn't really show up. There we are. Those red lines, so to speak. Question, moving back. So we're going to cycle back to sensitivity here. Thoughts people have on the sensitivity of the transit system, mass transit system, to climate impacts from heat and from storms.
For this section, are we kind of allowed to talk about, or I don't know, one of the things that I have the most concerns about is the number of stations or stops that currently don't have shelters or any type of natural shade with trees. So I'm thinking less in terms of like the asphalt will buckle because it's really hot, and more in terms of, well, I don't want to ride the bus in the summer because suddenly a third of the days of the year now are over 100 degrees if we're looking at some of the projections within all of our lifetimes, hopefully. I'm not going to stand out on the side of Hull Street to catch a bus when my bus only comes, you know, every 15 minutes and I have to stand 14 minutes out in my work clothes or my uniform. So that's kind of what I'm thinking. Like, how can we strategically invest in shelters in the places that are most impacted by heat? And then long-term, kind of how do we bolster that effort by planting shade trees that lowers the overall urban temperatures along those hotter corridors?
Yeah, I think I think that the there's this awkward divide between solutions and problems, but I definitely think that those human impacts and the question of a lack of bus shelters, for example, is a critical thing to be discussing as part of climate adaptation, in terms of the ability to use public transit and health and safety of people as weight, for example.
So I'm with Wyatt. I think heat is far more impactful to the public transit system, maybe not so much trains. You know, there's also an impact with, you know, high intensity of heat. You're really running that diesel bus or, you know, natural gas bus, whatever it might be in Richmond at this time. You're running a lot more of the air conditioning in the bus. So that increases costs, which then has a tangential effect of raising the cost to ride the bus, then less people ride it. So it's kind of like this domino effect. And then I'm with Wyatt, standing outside waiting for a bus in 100-degree weather is not a pleasant thing.
Absolutely. Carrie, how is GRTC thinking about these issues, to put you on the spot here?
Sure. So Wyatt's exactly right. Shelters are our focus in 2021 and 2022. This year, we plan to deploy dozens of shelters. And when I say shelter, these are new designs. They're not the old triangle-shaped green, you know, monstrosities that we deployed in the 90s. These are three-sided, clear on the back and the sides for safety and visibility, of course. But the roof itself is slanted and fully extends over the waiting space so that people would be under roof. And that's the type of shelter that we want to install throughout the network in the coming years. Now you're looking at that map that had all those little dots, and that's showing you bus stops in general. We have more than 1,600 bus stops in the network. The majority of those are, of course, within the city limits. So we can't put a shelter at every single bus stop, nor does every stop necessarily need a shelter. But we're trying to prioritize where's the greatest need and where's the vulnerability the greatest, and trying to balance those two when we place and distribute the shelters. The other thing that has nothing to do with physical infrastructure, it has to do with frequency. is if a bus is coming more frequently, then you won't have to wait as long outside for the bus. If you miss one or there's one not in service, if you offer better service, more frequency, that is, then you are giving people more opportunities to get out of the heat or out of the cold, depending on the time of year, and into the climate controlled bus. So that's another way that we can think about where do we run buses and how often do we run them.
Do you think in addressing the question of where they're putting the shelters, does the sort of question of heat vulnerability and the areas of the city with the highest urban heat island effect come into that decision-making process?
Well, this is where we get into intersectionality of issues, where you have the greatest heat island and climate vulnerabilities, at least in Richmond, have historically overlapped with communities of color. And that's where we are focusing, putting our shelters in this year, is in the East End. And that's in part because of funding that we received in partnership with Bon Secours Health System, again, linking back to community health. And how can you look at these indicators of lifespan and mitigate those risks with tangible action, which in this case is putting in bus stop shelters in the East End. But of course, we have to be equitable with how we spend state, local, federal dollars. So we are doing it across the network. You will see it on South Side, you'll see it in the West End, you'll see it North Side, but the majority of the shelters in the city are going into the East End, which is where you see those the deepest red color showing up.
Overlaps a lot. We have.
Hey, Marshall, can I just real quick, Carrie, just as a side note, our office would be more than happy to work with you guys. And we've done this with a number of community partners for different projects, green spaces most recently, but using our climate equity index to help pull various pieces of data and looking at all of these historical and current inequities around the community and sort of putting together, an index to prioritize areas within the community that are of highest need. And so we're happy to support you all, work with you on the shelter project as well, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, Alicia, do you know if you have anyone from your team at the city that's in the consultative group meetings every month? Because that's the city GRTC meeting every month where they go through the priority list and discuss all of the factors before they decide, the city, which stops they want us to move forward with.
Yeah,
first.
so I don't want to take up time here. So how about we'll touch base with you?
That sounds great.
Great.
That sounds great. I also pulled up a map. We have the most use of
So I just wanted to add to that because I think shelters not only help for heat, but also help for like microbursts, rain. So people don't want to stand in the rain either and wait for the.
Yep.
But you all know that.
Yeah. What about rail infrastructure? Does anyone here work at all with the rail system and is thinking about sort of what the vulnerabilities are with rail infrastructure in Richmond?
So this is Julie. I think of rail, particularly Amtrak for Richmond, as more of, a more global or external to Richmond. So if there's a problem, from where the train is coming from, you're going to see failure. That's going to have a ripple effect.
That's a great point. I think actually allows us to transition really well to, before we move on from rail and transit, to thinking again about some of these other consequences that we're seeing here, because the area of service loss for the impact could be substantial, and you do have that cascading impact. I'll also say, I know that when rail lines get hot, the train has to slow down, and so you have disrupted service due to reduced train speeds in heat. So that's an issue too. To say nothing.
I think our biggest issue with rail is that our Main Street station is relatively useless to folks. that there's only 2 trains per day. 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. is not very functional for people. So there might be some type of, climate incorporation into, as we think about planning out that connection, so that from Main Street, it goes further south again, and how we revert Main Street back to being the primary station, the most accessible station for folks with the most service. Yeah, as of right now, I don't think there's a ton of things to say about it, because the train, due to the moving of the station out to Staples Mill as the main station, I just don't think that's something that many Richmonders are able to take advantage of, because it's outside of their reach.
Yeah, and yeah, that's happening also because you have the split of the rail as it goes south happens north of the Main Street station. So only some of the trains actually go that way. All the trains going east do not. Looking at time here. Any other major sort of consequences around that we haven't talked about that people want to bring up for public transit or rail before we talk about bike and pedestrian? Okay. Please do fill out your thoughts on the survey, ranking them again. So we'll talk here a little bit, moving on to bike and pedestrian infrastructure. We talked a little bit about it earlier, Wyatt, thank you. So we want to continue talking about that. We're looking here about bike trails, share stations, sidewalk ramps, and other pedestrian infrastructure, and multi-use trails, and how these are impacted by both temperature and water, with the vulnerabilities there and how we adapt those systems. Right, you mentioned something about the fact that the rail lines, when they cross the ravines, don't have bridges, but actually have to go down into the ravine, and thus would be blocked if there was a major water flooding area in the ravine. That was one thing I heard that I think was a really good point.
Yeah, I think in general, Chaco Valley is a real mess. A lot of the crossings with the rail tracks are just really poorly thought out. And like where the Cannon Creek Greenway ends, it just kind of drops you in the middle of nowhere in Chaco Valley. Yeah, I don't know.
This is Alex. Another thing I've noticed, just biking around myself, especially during the summer when we have these random pop-up thunderstorms, and say you're leaving home to go to a meeting or something, or your only means of transportation is bike. Especially in the fall when we had heavy rain, the leaves in the gutter would often back up water so intensely in the bike lanes that it's already raining and you have to avoid these puddles, so you end up having to go into the street to get around them. And if you're not an experienced biker, that could be enough to deter you from ever wanting to do that again. Or there's existing places that have always flooded and haven't been repaired properly, or new infrastructure put in, like the corner of Lombardy and Brook Road, where while it's pouring down rain, I've often found myself just sitting in the middle of the street at a light in a puddle in the pouring rain with traffic all around me. So that being said, I mentioned earlier, as we plan for new bike lanes, be strategic about where we're putting them. And, there's certain parts of the city, like North Side and the East End, where ravines are unavoidable, or crossing train tracks are unavoidable. But I feel like these locations are often where stormwater infrastructure is really, really important, not just for vehicles, but also now if we're trying to put bike lanes in, bikes, and like we mentioned, water is diverted to gutters where we'll be biking. So I really like the idea of including, more bioswales and green stormwater infrastructure. And I would like to add that we've been in the process for a while of updating the City of Richmond's urban design guidelines. in part of our, streetscape design portion, there's been a lot of talk of, how to include stormwater infrastructure in street tree planting and different planting strips. And part of that was including, some curb cuts that would allow stormwater to go into tree wells or planting strips as a way to, let the water slowly get released back into the ground. And also to help with irrigation, because one of urban forestry's biggest things was the inability to adequately irrigate trees all the time when they're first planted. But, that's what I have to say about that.
No, that's definitely, that's very valuable. Very, very valuable thoughts.
I would also add the shade component is super important when biking in the summer. Bike lanes that have trees along them and give you those natural breaks of shade, especially, when you get caught at a red light and you happen to have that shade over top of you, it feels transformational in that moment. So if there were a way to kind of prioritize some of the tree planting and shades along, I don't know what we want to call them, but like active mobility corridors, I think that would be helpful. I mean, even if you just think about some of the like walking and jogging paths that we have around the city, having those covered in shade can be very important for people's public health also, because you get less impacted by heat exhaustion, or at least you're able to kind of find a place to rest underneath a tree if you start to feel too hot.
That's helpful. I love to talk about trees because with climate adaptation, we're thinking about impacts over the next 30, 50 years, and it's going to take a while for these trees to grow as well. So we need to be thinking about it now, but the solution, the impact doesn't come for a while. But all of this is a...
Hello. I'm a biker as well. Yeah, it's pretty substantial that we make sure the runoff of like these waters and plugs, drainage systems is like taking consideration, but also like being a jogger sometimes throughout the city is a pain, or even at nighttime, depending on if you're a night or morning jogger, is like how these sideways and how these pedestrians are like affected by the management of these sidewalks. Because sometimes I know I run around certain sidewalks in Richmond or East End because I don't want to twist my ankle again, or like I'm in the way of certain people running around. Is just like that chance of having equitable like transportation just on sidewalk priorities in this sense. As to bikers, I know there's a new bike lane that happened around Forest Hill. If everyone know where that is, by Forest Hill Park, and it's like at this weird curve area that a lot of traffic heads up to. And my friend lives around there, and a biker got at least hit once or twice there, and also accidents. So it's just like crucial to see where we implement these designs, where we put pathways or any type of like tree canopy in these areas to help out for all bikers and pedestrians in these later years of environment.
Thanks, Anthony. I think that's this is all really interesting. Obviously, the maintenance of these infrastructures are critical. When you're thinking about climate impacts, though, what are some maybe economic consequences or jobs, or what are some things that that aren't necessarily directly related that we might want to consider?
Well, tree canopy. I mean, Wyatt said it. It's just like having like the pleasure or the leisure of not being exhausted, especially at bus stops. We said earlier of like green space. Just, I mean, in the coming years of like public health safety, like I know there was like a chart of how many like asthma or heart conditions or whatever related by heat impacts in like whatever 10-15 mile radius of transportation to get to these hospitals or whatever are having a high impact because of these less areas. So I mean that could be one. I mean, I'm just looking overall, sorry.
No, that's those public health impacts are really important. Are there particular populations that you're seeing that are particularly being impacted by the lack of sufficient adaptive capacity to storms with roads and pedestrian bike infrastructure that are worth highlighting here?
I mean, I think it's only not only, it's areas that are really subject to like poverty line, and like where they're seeing these areas of underdevelopment areas that people don't really see these as a positive thing in their environment, but like we see that could make a big difference. Because I know, coming from Northside near Highland Park, I know that area, Highland Park, is not let's say loved to, in a matter of sense of like equal treatment as in West End, as we see, or how we see, you know, in the South Side district, of that fine line of division between Jefferson Davis or like Hall Street, and seeing those being tremendously impacted throughout the community. And I mean, it's a lot of specific areas that may do it. Like, I don't want to take the bus on Hall Street as anyone else, because how noise pollution is also a thing of like, I like, as much as I love living in a city, some people don't, because they can hear everything outside their door, their living spaces every day. And how does that take into a change effect of like transportation means, and how that's gonna publicly help impact those communities. So, you know, more vulnerable areas of pollutions and like low income places, or areas that has need affordable living, and seeing where we put these into it instead of, you know, redlining as a thing. So, you know, a lot of that.
Yeah, I want to add in that I think like the bigger question we need to be asking ourselves as a city is like, do we want to be a good place for people to quickly drive through, or do we want to be a good place where people want to spend time? Because I think you can apply that to almost any neighborhood in the city. When you think about like a Carytown or a Brooklyn Park Boulevard, like the reasons I don't generally enjoy the time I spend there is because people are going like 40 miles per hour in a 25. There's not good places to cross. There aren't really many street trees. There's not any accessible kind of public space, so I can pick up, you know, I can get an ice cream from a shop, and my partner can grab a sandwich, and we can both sit outside somewhere and kind of enjoy the day, and then maybe go and buy other things. And I think improving these places, like making it a better pedestrian experience for folks, is really important, because people want to come and spend their money. And it's really nice for the local businesses when they are in a place that's enjoyable for people to spend time, because you always end up spending more money than you planned when you headed over there, as a product of the longer that you spend in that place.
So I would add to that, climate, like flooding, microburst, rain, heat, really deters people from wanting to walk or wanting to ride their bike. So the more uncertainty I think there is with weather, the less likely people are going to make that choice or want to make that choice to go somewhere. And then add on top of that, the infrastructure, how that's all set up, whether or not it's bike or pedestrian friendly, just further exacerbates that.
We talked a lot about flooding, backing up and blocking bike lanes. How does that end up impacting pedestrian corridors and sidewalks as well?
I mean, I go walking a lot for exercise now that I can't do anything else safely. And there are just certain blocks on North Side that I avoid because the sidewalks are consistently flooded. And even when there's not standing water, it leaves mud and kind of like residue behind that makes it anywhere from unpleasant to unsafe because it's very slippery and mucky. So as someone who walks a lot, I do think it's really important not ending up stuck in puddles. I think the factor of shade is also once again important. And just the presence of trees absorb a lot of sound. So it's much more enjoyable to walk on a street that has a lot of trees, even though the traffic can still be unenjoyable on something like a Brook Road. The fact that there's so many trees there, it makes it relatively better than other places that are more exposed. Also, even just for like the wind chill factor, I notice when I walk on Chamberlain, it feels like I'm in the tundra. Whereas if I walk on a more interior street like Seminary that has a lot of tree cover, it feels very, very still and surprisingly warm, relatively speaking.
Because of the wind tunnel effect that you're getting on some streets? Is that...
Yeah, I'm myself am very surprised that this has become like a tree cheerleading team, because I didn't come in here with like a pro tree agenda, but it seems to be coming up again and again that I'm like, where are the 40,000 trees we need?
I think we also have to think about additional solutions, especially for shorter term issues, because of the time it takes to really grow a beautiful tree. Julie, go ahead.
Yeah, but yes, I just want to add, like, I work downtown, and I was always more likely to walk if I was coming from our Tredegar campus, because there's that nice river walk. And like temperature wise, it's cooler because of the water, the actual river, it's cooler. So my season in which I would walk was much extended because of the river. So maybe it's not just trees. Maybe it's actually getting the walk places closer, to the creeks. And, I know there might be a safety aspect to that, but is there a way that you can weave in, walking and bike trails around where the water is flowing? That also cools things down as well.
Yeah. I really like how this is all going back to the natural resources and how they can help us mitigate these concerns. In the interest of time here, going to be please put any other thoughts you have on biking and pedestrian infrastructure in the survey. And in the 10 or so minutes we have left, I want to talk a little bit about marine and air. So starting with marine and the Port of Richmond, people's thoughts about the vulnerability of the port to climate impacts and its capacity to adapt. Obviously, the port is in water, but that doesn't mean it's well prepared. Does anyone here go down to have any experience with the port, or is it just it's such a commercial industrial facility that people aren't interacting with it at all? I'm curious.
Can you toggle on the floodplain? Oh, that's what you're doing. Okay, good. Because I was like, I've never been there when it's raining. I've only been there when it's dry.
Here's the port. We'll zoom in. There's the marine port. 3 feet sea level rise. You see it's beginning to inundate some portions of the port. But if we look at the flood scenario, 2030 flood scenario, 2070 flood scenario, port's entirely underwater, entirely flooded out. So, or at least
I know that there's a surprising amount of traffic that actually goes. So while I can't profess to have much personal experience with it, because it is, I think, strategically isolated from the rest of the city by 95. I do think even if we don't have an emotional connection or a personal experience with it, it needs to be something that we think really critically about, simply because it is a way that we get a lot of goods brought into the city.
And actually, I hadn't thought about this before. But I think what would be a great idea is to share this information with our economic development folks from the city. They're not on this call, unfortunately, but while there's not a ton of stuff there now, I know the city increasingly has, along with the Economic Development Authority, been doing a lot of work around the port. And it's somebody else on the call may remember, be aware, if you were involved in the Richmond 300 process, if this is one of the growth nodes or not. Is anybody aware? If they could say, but anyway, bottom line, I think, okay. I think this is really important information to share with our economic development folks, so that they just are aware of this moving forward, because there are a lot of plans around the port, around that interchange in particular. So.
Yeah, it seems like of all the things, this would have the greatest direct economic impact and damage of everything we talked about so far.
Yeah, agreed.
And jobs impact as well, I would assume.
Yeah, and I also can't remember, and if somebody else knows, the port, I can't recall if it's owned by the state and they have a third party managing it at this point. Does anyone recall?
It's actually directly owned by the Port Authority.
Oh, okay.
So it is owned by the state, and they're actually doing some pretty cool pilot programs to electrify the bigger cranes and little like trolleys that move stuff around. And if that goes well here in Richmond, then they plan to expand it down to the port in Norfolk.
Gotcha. So I imagine they're very well aware of the flood scenarios and everything else, but I think our own sort of city folks just probably would be good for us internally to share and make them all aware of it. So.
Absolutely. And there are best practices from other, ports that are looking at, sea level rise, for example, primarily, and thinking about how do you address that from the perspective of the port. This map is just looking at the sort of elevation as recorded in the data. In fact, you might have things that are built up and might be more protected, or you might have or drainage areas. But definitely, I think that's a crucial connection to make. The consequences thing here, I think, is really important with the port in terms of the impact on economic activities, and also I would think the sort of duration of, if you had a major flooding event there, I would assume there would be an impact on duration of service loss, and there might be ways that natural environment could help there as well. Any other port thoughts before we talk about the airport, which is also a port, different port? Okay. Richmond Airport, I think, was the last transportation piece we wanted to try to talk about in terms of the impact of climate on that. I don't have, because it's outside the city, I don't actually have a map of, I don't think, let's find out. I don't think the map shows, yeah, it doesn't show anything out here. So I don't know what the impact is. So it's very much a hypothetical exercise, but questions about the impact on the airport, I think, important to discuss.
Is the airport still owned by the city?
Alicia?
Oh, no, it's an authority as well, as far as my understanding. So the city of Richmond doesn't own the airport.
This to me feels like someone else's problem.
Well, it's located in Henrico County. The city doesn't own it. I'm pretty sure it's independently or owned by an authority. But Marshall, what was your, and apologies, because I don't think we had a chance as a team to talk about this, but what was your thought in terms of relevance or reason to discuss?
The concern here was we were just trying to think through the various transportation assets and the impact that negative climate impacts could have on Richmond. So I think, here, really, I think the main thing to talk about, I guess, would be a question of consequence.
I think so too. Yeah.
The consequences for the city of, if the airport is, portions of the airport are out of commission due to storms or due to heat impacts, and sort of slowing of operations there, and sort of what the economic impact is on the city.
This is Carrie. I mean, my first thought are the goods that come in every day on FedEx, UPS, and mail.
So the
Yeah,
city-
in general, I'll just say it's probably a similar dynamic to the issue with the port. There's just a lot of commerce, and whether it's goods or it's people going in and out for business or whatever it might be. I mean, clearly that could be different with Zoom now, but yeah, it seems like another one of those ones where on the economic development side, there's conceivably lots of disruptive activity that could happen if planes can't operate like normal.
I'll also add on to that. I know that there are a lot of businesses that are growing around the airport now. For example, I think Sabra, the hummus people, built their factory somewhere over there. So I don't know. It seems like the business community and the airport folks would be tackling this themselves, but I do think it is of economic consequence to our region. My guess is just that those folks know it better than we do, and they're going to be doing their best to look out for their own economic interests in a way that they won't be looking out for other parts of the city.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, though. I think I would caution that one should never assume that someone is thinking about the future impacts of climate change on the assets that they're responsible for. I wish that we could assume that people are always doing that, and that if it was someone else's problem, that means it's being cared for by someone else. But in my experience, it's not a given, sadly. So I think this is definitely another area, Alicia, where like communication from the city and sort of trying to sort of talk with them about what their plans are and being able to sort of reference that would probably be the right approach.
So I would say micro weather events would probably be impactful to the airport that may have consequences to the people that live in Richmond. Because if that's your main airport you fly out of and all the flights are canceled because there's a storm coming in, that could definitely affect the citizens of Richmond.
Yeah, I think that's a good solution, good thing to focus on there. If it's taken out by a hurricane, the rest of the city is probably not trying to fly anywhere anyway. But a more localized storm could have a very negative impact. All right, well, this has been, I think, overall a great conversation. I would also, I was going to add more, but I won't. Any other, I think they're going to bring us back in like 1 minute. So any other thoughts, people, 56 seconds. Any other transportation thoughts people wanted to share on any of the topics we've discussed that we haven't gotten to? All right. Everyone said everything they had to say, or probably better yet, maybe you've put it in the comments. So just a reminder, please, everybody, finish the survey. You can check not sure about things if you're really not sure, but do fill it out. Any other thoughts you have, put it in the comments, and remember to hit done when you are done. So otherwise we don't get that information. And look forward to talking to you all back in the main group in 20 seconds.